Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Weatherhead. I'm the Organisation and Projects Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or rather handily, WEALL for short. And I was asked by Lars to just share some thoughts and reflections with you about the journey that WEALL has had, and also this concept of a wellbeing economy, and why we believe the future economy really needs to be a well-being economy. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So what is a good life anyway? This is really the key question, and the key question that we believe the economy should be able to answer and support. Ultimately, a good life, well, you can read about what a good life is if you scan the writings of great scholars who describe the purpose of development and human progress. You can view it in the brain scans of neuroscientists, which show when our brain lights up when we are content and we are relaxed. And you can also hear it in conversations with people around the world where they discuss what matters most for them. So critical, we believe, is an economy that supports what that is. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that what we've done is, in effect, brought that into 5 key needs. And so this was a collective effort on behalf of many members of the WEALL family. And really to distill what are the needs that an economy in service of well-being should be supporting. And I'll sort of group them slightly. I think connection and participation are 2 critical sort of bedfellows, if you like. Connection is all important. We are ultimately social beings. We need to have a sense of belonging, and critically, we need institutions that serve the common good, not just the needs of the few. But also, in order to really experience the good life, we need to participate in it. We cannot be passive observers. We cannot simply be treated within an economic system as passive consumers. We need to actively engage in our communities and have locally rooted economies. And that links very much to that sort of connection, that sense of belonging. So far, so not very economicsy, but this is why we're challenged the current economic orthodoxy, which suggests that there is sort of one metric, which if we sort of follow that North Star, and I'll come to that in a minute, everything else will be fine. Critically, we also need to consider and meet the needs of fairness and dignity in a well-being economy. In terms of dignity, we need everyone to be able to live in comfort, safety, and happiness. We cannot simply just have that for a percentage of the population. It really needs to stretch out to the entire population. And it's interesting, you see how this word dignity has really, I think, caught the imagination, particularly of politicians in the United States, because a dignity is a word that resonates with people. They want to have dignified lives. It doesn't take a huge amount to have a dignified life, but it often requires more than what they currently survive on, and the way that they're treated and the way that they are viewed in the economic system. And fairness is sort of critically linked to that, but it's sort of zooming out from the individual dignity to the sort of society. And we need to have a society which, to be honest, is far less unequal than we see it in many countries around the world. Now, I suspect that's significantly less of an issue in Denmark than it is, for example, in the United Kingdom or the United States. But there are many countries where a basic sort of injustice in all its dimensions, really, and the gap between the rich and the poor just greatly increasing at the moment. That needs to be reversed in any economic system. It's interesting that when I studied economics back at university, inequality was something which was not considered necessarily to be a concern of economists. Squarely sort of refute that and suggest critical for any type of healthy society that an economy is cognizant of the fairness of the outcomes produced. And then lastly, of these 5 needs, a well-being economy is not just well-being for humans, it is well-being for the planet and all other living systems. You know, at the end of the day, we have a system which we are embedded in. Since the Enlightenment of 300 years ago, we've been using the type of language where we say nature is our slave, we are there to control it. We need to change that mindset in order to be able to fully understand how we live within this system and therefore operate within this system as well. Next slide, please. But I wouldn't want you to simply just take my words for it. This is the Irish President, Michael Higgins, suggesting that there is an alternative paradigm which is starting to gain acceptance. I'll just quote here, as our only realistic alternative to avoid the continuation of yawning inequality and ecological devastation. This new paradigm is one based on a steady state model. So right there, indicating that the current economic system under which we operate is simply one. And this has been backed up by the work of Piketty. It's also been evidenced in the fact that there are very few defenders of the current neoliberal system who can actually indicate that the current rules of the game can deal with the ecological devastation as well as the rising inequality. Yes, some countries are better at redistributing, but there's a question around pre-distribution that perhaps we need to talk to. But if we go on from Michael Higgins and his suggestion that we perhaps need to focus on a steady state model, this comes to the sort of first key point. Next slide, please. That, if we can just move on. Thank you. That we need to be fair weather friends of growth. So this is not a degrowth lecture. This is not a degrowth, anti-growth commentary. It's a suggestion that in transitioning to a new economic paradigm, there could well be growth in some sectors. However, there will likely need to be degrowth in other sectors. We need to be fair weather friends of growth, not its ever faithful followers. And that's a sort of a key break that we need to make with the current economic system, where we have GDP, we hold GDP up as our North Star. And for many decades, we've simply just assumed that growth in GDP will lead to overall human progress. And that's shown not to be the case. We've seen that growth has, in the past, of course, created many positives in terms of improved quality of life for some, but not necessarily for all. However, it has done it at the expense of the earth, and we are now hitting, and we are now right up against ecological limits, and therefore, in the famous sort of phrase of Einstein, we can't solve the same problems with the same type of thinking as gone before. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so where the well-being economy agenda is being picked up. To carry on, I want to show with the next slide that this agenda, and I think it is a growing agenda, does have long roots. For many of you, you may know of the Robert Kennedy speech in 1968, where he famously talked about GNP, as that's what they measured in America. Measures everything except that which is worth, that in life which is worthwhile. So GDP counts up all of the sort of environmental bads and treats them as positive in terms of growth. It doesn't reflect, it doesn't consider the sort of quality of our interactions, the quality of much of our sort of civic life. It really is a very crude measure. And to be fair to those who created the metric in the first place, Hasnet and others, they slapped on a health warning right at the beginning when they created, saying this is not a good measure of progress. However, in the 1940s, during the Second World War, it was a very useful metric for measuring economic production. However, the trouble is it's stuck around and we've not managed to shake it since. Anyway, starting with Kennedy, we move into the 70s, and of course the seminal publication of The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome, really highlighting, and this caused quite a stir back at the time, that actually we cannot go on this continuous path of growth. If anyone who has studied the thermodynamics of physics will know, in growth in perpetuity on a finite planet is simply not physically impossible, and yet we manage to mentally, as economists, sort of trick ourselves into believing that it is. So we need to kick ourselves, kick that habit of that belief that that is possible. Same year, Bhutan, the first country to declare gross national happiness to be more important than GDP, considered as a bit of a sort of a slightly sort of crazy notion back in those days, but just only 10 years ago, holding court at the United Nations on just such a theme, as more of the world is really starting to sit up and take note. Now, if we sort of jump forward into the last decade or so, we see the 2009 Sarkozy study, Commission, we see the UN report on a new development paradigm, we see the SDGs starting to come on board. There's starting to be a momentum around seriously considering what is the alternative North Star if we are thinking about economic development. So next slide, please. And it's really accelerated of late. The OECD is very good in terms of advancing the consideration of alternative metrics with a number of its studies. And that has actually prompted a number of the wealthy countries of the world to actually jump off from that point, New Zealand being an obvious point in case, launching the first well-being budget around the world. The same year, 2019, just 2 years ago, the Finnish EU presidency, leading on the economy of well-being. And now we're seeing more at the city level, cities starting to engage with frameworks which sit very much within the well-being economy agenda. For example, the city of Amsterdam adopting the donut model for framing their future economic decision-making. The city of Cadiz in Spain adopting the economy for common good framework for considering their decision-making. And so, whilst with long roots, I would suggest this is really starting to build momentum. In the middle of this, and I've not included this as a date, in 2018, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance was formed. Really, now the leading global collaboration of organizations, alliances, movements, and individuals working towards this goal of an economic system that has human and ecological wealth very much at its heart. Next slide, please. So what next for the Wellbeing Economy agenda as it really starts to pick up pace? Well, there is a strong case for advancing and supporting further pro-social businesses to change the economic ecosystem of the economy. Businesses are a critical but not only actor in this space. You know, perhaps we need to be exploring some of the more radical considerations. Maybe we need to be moving beyond public limited companies. Maybe we need to be looking seriously at the ownership models of more organizations if we are to meet those 5 needs, particularly around participation. How do we respond to the demands by citizens to be involved in policy making? This is really this loss of trust and faith in many public institutions around the world is in part because of this lack of participation in the democratic decision-making space that is starting to be readdressed with direct democracy, but there clearly needs to be a greater involvement of citizens in policy making for them to fully step into the economic paradigm. And then ultimately moving beyond policy, moving policy beyond treatment to prevention at the roots of causes. So much of government spending is spending designed to repair the damage caused by the economy in the first place. We are shortly about to be presenting a report looking at the avoidable demands of business in 2 countries, Scotland and in Canada, highlighting just how much money is spent fixing the system. And surely, we argue, it would be a more efficient system if we were not creating those issues or that damage in the first place and needing to repair it. So how do we go about doing this? Well, final slide, if you could, please. The model that we have for achieving economic systems change is sort of simplified in this tree diagram. We have 2 key roots to the tree. We have knowledge and we have narrative, and both are equally as important. I can say that because I live in a country which has seen a sort of rupture with the European family because one side only communicated knowledge, the other communicated a narrative. One could argue that that was a false narrative, but it was an effective narrative, and it resulted in the United Kingdom falling out of the European Union. So both are essential. You cannot simply intellectually make the case, you need to emotionally make the case as well. And so we are doing that in creating new narratives about what an economy might look like, one so attractive that people want to step into it, they see themselves in it. But we support that with curated work, highlighting, amplifying the solutions that are already out there, but perhaps are a little bit disparate and need support and amplification for them to replicate and to scale, and to bring those to the attention of decision makers. And those decision makers are often found in the trunk of the tree, the power bases. We have a number of power bases. We have over 200 members now. We have 2,500 citizens and growing. We have a number of place-based hubs around the world. And place-based hubs are in effect we all, but focused in a particular location. We have them in New Zealand, Scotland, Costa Rica. We are about to have them develop in Argentina, in South Africa. We have them in Canada. They are growing as a real power base to bring together business, policymakers, and civil society, really act as the connectors between those three groups, all of whom are essential to achieve this economic paradigm change. We do not believe that the next paradigm shift in economics is going to be created the same way as the last one was back in the late 70s, with just an elite-driven model of trying to affect key leading actors. We need a bottom-up movement in addition. However, that is not to say that we do not need those governments. And if we can move to the final slide, we've realized this and addressed this with the creation of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. So this is an extremely exciting partnership where 5 governments from around the world, Finland, Scotland, Iceland, Wales, and New Zealand, have come together in recognition that there is more to life than GDP. And they come together in policy labs on a regular basis to discuss and learn and share and explore how policy might look if well-being was the destination, not simply growth in perpetuity. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. I don't want to take any more of the time because I understand we want to give enough space for any questions that people have.